Okay, I'm here today with Tanya Jenkins, the author of Doctor's Orders, The Making of Status Hierarchies in an Elite Profession. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Tanya.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Can you start, now, first of all, the people that are listening, our audience are medical students, pre-medical students, and physicians. So some of us, myself included, may not know exactly what so you're a sociologist, right? So can you just tell us what a sociologist is and what a sociologist does?
Yeah, I'll start with sort of what is sociology, and at its basic core, it's the study of society, right? It's the study of groups, of institutions, of collective arrangements within society. And so a sociologist is really interested in how society works, how it doesn't work sometimes, and how it's organized. And so, as a sociologist, I'm interested broadly in these types of questions, how different institutions within society either work together and are organized in different ways.
Okay, so that's great. And as a sociologist, and again, I'm sounding really silly on this, but so I'm a gastroenterologist and I study the GI tract. You're a sociologist, you study society, but you are a scientist. You're not like giving your opinion, you're looking at something critically. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So as a social scientist, I gather data in a rigorous fashion and really try to sort of make sense of what the data is telling me in terms of broader patterns in society. And so when we collect data as sociologists, we're really looking at, what are the patterns and what do these data tell us about broader phenomena within the sort of the social realm, if you will. And so we're less interested in sort of idiosyncrasies and more interested in finding patterns and themes that might span different kinds of aspects of society.
That's so interesting, right? So different than what we do as physicians, but so interesting. So can you tell me, Tanya, so the book is called Doctor's Orders. How did you come up with the idea for the book? Can you tell us a little bit about the book and what you looked at in your research?
Yeah, the book came about, as many research projects do, by accident. I started the research for the book as a doctoral student, getting my PhD in sociology, and I had to take a course as part of my early training on a particular data collection method that's called ethnography. And ethnography is basically going somewhere and sitting and observing a social space and also interviewing folks in that space to get a better understanding of how it works. The topic of the course was political ethnography. And I remember being a little bit disgruntled because as a medical sociologist, I studied medicine, not politics, is what I used to think. And of course, politics really means power and hierarchy. And so for this class project, I thought, I have to go and I have to sit and observe somewhere. I'm a medical sociologist, I'm going to go sit and observe in a hospital. And it just so happened that the hospital that I was able to go and observe at the beginning was a smaller community hospital. And it eventually sort of occurred to me that this hospital, even though there were a bunch of Americans on the house staff, this is the internal medicine residency program that I was observing, none of them, at least as part of the categorical internal medicine program, none of them had actually gone to a US MD school. Some of them were DOs and others had gone mostly to the Caribbean to study, but not exclusively. And so I was puzzled by this a little bit. Where were all the American trained MDs? Why were none of them at this program? And when I zoomed out a little bit, as I was doing this class project, I realized that another hospital sort of nearby was this large university program that staffed exclusively US MDs. So a puzzle started to form for me as a sociologist. Why the segregation, right? Why the polarization between these two programs? What impact does that segregation have on the training in these two programs? And how does it affect what we would call mobility, the sort of career trajectories for trainees out of this program moving forward into their careers? How does that segregation and the training that they get in these programs shape their careers moving forward? So what started out as a kind of, frustrating class project for me turned into what eventually became my doctoral dissertation and the book that you've already introduced, Doctor's Orders. It's a book that ended up culminating in about 23 months of intensive observations and over 120 interviews of folks in these two segregated residency programs to get a better understanding of these status hierarchies within medicine.
So interesting, Tanya. And again, I think for our listeners specifically, there are pre-medical students that are thinking like, should I go to a USMD school? Should I go to a Caribbean school? Should I become a DO? Again, and obviously that's part of the reason why we're doing this podcast. And, for doctors that are in practice, there are a lot of people that are like, yeah, we know this, like a lot of the things that you're bringing up, we know, and we just don't talk about, right? Or kind of, why don't we talk about it? And are these things okay? And what should we do about them? Or should we do anything about them? Are they fair?
Mm-hmm.
So, Tanya, right? So I want to start asking you to define some terms, which were educational for me. These are terms that I hadn't heard before.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about social hierarchy? Maybe we'll just start with that.
Yeah, social hierarchy is really about thinking about the way that society is organized and thinking about the position that we all hold within society. And so given that your status, another way of putting status is your social worth, is influenced by a number of different factors, we can think of hierarchies along any number of sort of social axes, right? We can think of racial hierarchies, gender hierarchies, income hierarchies. The kinds of hierarchies that I was interested in this book are really status hierarchies along the lines of your social worth as a trainee or as a physician, as determined by where you went to medical school. Because, as I mentioned, in studying these two hospitals, it seemed pretty important. It seemed to be a pretty important factor, not the only factor to be sure, but a pretty important factor for helping determine which kind of programs that trainees would end up in. And so the hierarchies that I was particularly interested in were the sort of the rank ordering of people by their social worth based on where they went to medical school.
So cool. Yeah. So, and just for the listeners, in the book, and we're going to go over a couple more terms, but in the book, you basically break the two categories are US trained MDs and then other, sort of other people, which would include us, the DOs, foreign graduates, so American doctors that are people that are from America and trained outside the US, and foreign physicians who came over to train in the US, right? The people that are not US citizens. Those three groups are in a separate one category.
That's right. And I debated for a while whether to group that heterogeneous group of folks together into one category, namely non-US MDs. And I also don't like necessarily defining a group by what they're not, right? But what I did find is that whether it's US IMGs, or DOs, that what they have in common within the profession is that for various reasons, they're kind of viewed and treated in many, maybe not all instances, but in a lot of instances as kind of second-class citizens. They're stigmatized for different reasons, but they share that stigmatized status within medicine. And so for that reason, I decided to group them together.
Right. And just as a point of fact, I believe, and I think you pointed out in the book, the NRMP or the match classically always gave percentages of US MDs and then everybody else, right? So again, as DOs, we were grouped into this general bag category.
Yeah. That has changed a little bit, right? Since now you're going to be able to help me out here, but the joint accreditation, right, of residency programs. Now I believe that match statistics are reported for USMDs, DOs, and then everybody else.
Yeah.
But up until recently, even fellowship statistics, this was impressive to me. Even fellowship statistics were reported along the lines of where folks went to medical school. There was a column for USMDs and then a column for everyone else. even after having completed residency in the United States. And so
Right.
that status seems to be quite important. Yeah.
Agreed. Agreed. Okay. So next definition, if you would be a social contract. Can you please tell us? That comes up a lot in the book.
Yes. And well, there are various social contracts that exist in society. There are two that I think are important for our purposes. The first is probably in a context that you're familiar with, the social contract between medicine as a profession and society. That, you know, in exchange for trust and a certain amount of prestige, society expects that physicians will care for patients, will often, you know, put patients' interests above their own, that sort of thing. So there's the social contract between the profession of medicine and everybody else, society. I put forth in the book that there's also a social contract, a bargain, if you will, between USMDs and the profession. So this is a professional kind of social contract. And it was described to me as such. I wish I could take credit for this term, but it was described to me by my respondents in contractual terms. That in essence, in exchange for years and years of hard work, deferred gratification, hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt, that in exchange for those inputs, that USMDs come to expect a certain return on their investment, that they get something out of that. And namely, first of all, definitely matching to a residency program, safe passage through medical school, and loosely sort of being able to have the opportunities that they want to be able to access. And as I mentioned, you know, there was very much this sense of, well, I've paid my dues. Now I'm expecting a return on that investment, whether it's the residency program that I want to match to or the fellowship program that I want to match to. And I argue that bargain, it's unspoken in a lot of cases, right? So aside from having a sociologist sort of poking around and asking questions about these things, you know, we don't really talk about it so much within medicine, but that there is this sort of inputs and outputs that that shape, I think, a lot of what happens within medicine and a lot of how opportunities get distributed. Because it wasn't just from students that I heard about this contract, it was also from folks involved in residency recruitment decisions, right? That there was this sense of having to prioritize USMDs because they had sort of put in the hard work and dedication and that they expected to get those top positions.
Right. Tanya, can I ask you, you know, again, just thinking it in broad term, like obviously as a DO, that's not something that you like to hear, but, you know, if we look at, you know, I have friends that are accountants or, you know, that are MBAs in finance that went to Wharton or you know, looking at, you know, being in a hedge fund, like, you know, again, let's use a hedge fund, for example. Like if you graduate from Wharton or you graduate from Harvard Business School, you're going to expect a position in, say, a big firm in, you know, I live in New York, so we're talking about Manhattan, but that's pretty understood. And maybe if you go to a lower level school, those opportunities may be more difficult to come by. So this is not just something that we see in medicine. Would you agree that those are similar social contracts?
I think so. I think one distinction is that part of the social contract is a kind of, in medicine, is a kind of what I argue is sponsorship. The idea that USMDs are really helped along the way to their sort of intended career goals. And so, you know, the metaphor that I use in the book is that what I observed is that USMDs will often enjoy tailwinds, right? If we think of like the metaphor of a plane, they've got winds that are pushing them, making it easier for them to get to their desired destinations. And in contrast, I found that non-USMDs are often facing headwinds, right? They're often not only not getting that extra push or those extra sort of assists along the way, but they're also facing additional barriers associated with where they went to medical school. So, you know, I can't say that I've studied hedge fund or finance folks. I have given a lot of thought to the social contract in my profession of academia, where, PhD students don't pay typically to get a PhD. In fact, we're often given a stipend to, TA or whatever. We're given a very sort of paltry sum of money to get through our training. The returns on the investment are also significantly different than they are in medicine, for example. So after graduating with a PhD, you often will earn a lot less than you would graduating from an MD program, for example, or a DO program. So I don't think that professional social contracts are unique to medicine, but I do think that at least from what I've observed, there really is this this strong sense of sponsorship within MD schools in particular to help MD students get to where they want to go.
Right. I could definitely say, Tanya, off the top of my head, I can definitely think of examples of this in my career and in careers of my friends. So I definitely think that that is a good observation. The next thing that I'm going to ask you is meritocracy. Can you define meritocracy for us and tell us what that term means?
Meritocracy is actually a term that was proposed as satire. The person who came up with the term is British, and he came up with the concept of meritocracy as a kind of satire where people who are most meritorious, however you conceptualize that, those who are who excel the most, who have sort of the most skills, who show the most promise, are those who end up sort of in positions of power, are those who get rewarded. And he proposed it as a kind of satire because he argued that, that the way that people sort of end up deciding who is most meritorious can actually end up being quite political. And I think, in the book, I sort of point to the fact that there's this broad belief, and I actually go so far as to label it a myth within medicine, that medicine is a meritocracy, that with enough hard work and dedication, with enough achievement, that hard work and dedication will get rewarded. As you mentioned, it's sort of it's actually an idea that's integral to the American dream, right? That with enough hard work and dedication, anything is possible. And I want to stress that it's not that hard work doesn't matter. That's not the take-home message at all. It matters. It's just not the only thing that matters, right? It's necessary, but not sufficient. And I think, what gets overemphasized in the myth of meritocracy in medicine is the power of hard work, that's really all it takes. I mean, of course, intelligence and dedication and putting in the time, right? But what gets under acknowledged are what sociologists would call the structural factors. Those factors that are beyond the individual's control, like status hierarchies, right? Like beliefs about, where one goes to medical school and how those factor into beliefs about the worthiness of a particular candidate. Things like the sponsorship that USMDs get, right? So they got help getting to where they are, help that often doesn't get acknowledged. So when I refer to the myth of meritocracy in medicine, it's not that hard work doesn't pay off or that it's not important or that it doesn't get rewarded. It's that's not the only thing, maybe not even the most important thing that helps determine who gets to be sort of rewarded, if you will, within medicine.
Okay, perfect. And then my last, and I hope I'm not boring you by making you define these terms, but I think they're super interesting, is sponsored contract versus mobility.
So it's sponsored versus contest mobility.
Oh, please, yes, please.
Yeah, so this is a term that was actually, I believe it was coined by a sociologist, Turner, in the 1960s, who was writing about the British high school training system versus the American high school system. And he was referring to the British system as a kind of sponsored mobility. Mobility is really thinking about the change in social position, right? We talk about hierarchies. It's like moving from the bottom to the top. So in a sponsored mobility system, trainees, so folks that were sort of in elite prep schools in Britain were chosen to be in those positions on the basis of whether other elites judged that candidate to have qualities that are seen as sort of desirable by fellow members of the elite. So they're effectively chosen and then sort of helped through the training system in the UK to become graduates of elite programs. And he was contrasting it to what he was observing in the US, which is what he called contest mobility, the idea where, you know, elite status is the prize at the end of the game in an open contest. A different way of thinking about it is that in sponsored mobility, getting in is the prize because you're guaranteed to eventually graduate from this elite institution and reap all the benefits that come from that. In a contest system, graduating at the end is the elite prize, and not everyone's going to make it to the end. And so you can see how these two concepts are quite powerful if we think about the social contract within medicine and about the different kinds of mobility that different types of medical graduates experience. And in the first chapter of the book, I argue that USMDs are much more likely to experience sponsored mobility, right? Where, you know, a lot of USMDs say the hardest part was getting into medical school. And then it's sort of downhill from there. It's not that they stopped working hard, but it's that their futures were pretty much guaranteed. Whereas for a lot of DOs and international graduates, you know, getting into medical school, it was just the beginning, right? The content, the hard work, you know, nothing was guaranteed until sort of, you know, the end and making it into residency and beyond.
I think that's an amazing point. And just to reiterate something else that you talk about in the book is that a lot of, you know, again, potentially a lot of USMDs are from more affluent families and have more maybe opportunity to do extracurricular activities. And obviously we're overgeneralizing. And as a doctor, I always want to be careful that I'm not offending anybody. But a large percentage of those people are going to maybe elite colleges and have sort of a leg up even getting into medical school, right? I mean, that's one of the points you bring up.
Absolutely. So what one of the first concepts I introduced in the book is the idea of playing the game. Again, not my concept, this is directly from my respondents, how they describe the process of getting into medical school, getting into residency, matching to fellowship is they describe it as playing a game. And some of them joke that it starts in utero, right? That, you know, it starts way before you start thinking about applying, you know, to medical school. And what I found in the sample of residents that I spoke to were that USMDs had help playing the game even before getting into medical school. And then this is part of the tailwinds analogy, right? And then got more help once they were in medical school from the profession. Whereas a lot of international and osteopathic graduates came from more modest backgrounds, didn't have as much help playing the game. So they didn't come from as affluent backgrounds. They didn't have parents who could, you know, bring them to ballet practice and then to, you know, EMS classes, et cetera, et cetera. And sort of had to fight harder to play that game, and then continue to have to fight to create opportunities for themselves, even once they got into medical school.
Yeah, Tanya, I love the whole playing the game. I mean, we talk about that all the time. I think that for MDs and for DOs, maybe the game is different in a lot of ways. And again, for foreign medical graduates as well, but I'm going to focus on us. But, you know, it's funny, just to flatter you a little bit or flatter the book, you know, they asked me to speak at a pre-SOMA at one of the DO conferences, and I want to title my presentation "How to Play the Game." So yeah, I'll give you credit, of course. So Tanya, can you, and I want to go back to that. I want to talk about playing the game in a little bit. But can you at this point, and then I want to go into a whole bunch of questions that I have. Can you tell us a little bit about, and I don't want to ruin the book. I think everybody should read your book. I loved your book. My son was amazed that I sat for 4 hours while I was doing homework and was taking notes while I was reading. Can you tell us a little bit about what, just basically what you found in your research, which I think you alluded to when you looked at these two, so you had a university program, you had a community program. The community program is mostly non-USMDs. The university program, right, is USMDs. You talk a little bit about tiers, right? Like what tiers the residencies are in, and then how they choose residents and how they go forward. Can you tell us a little bit about what you found and what your research showed?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the first chapter looks at these headwinds and tailwinds that different types of graduates experience. And to be sure, in the first chapter, I do separate out the experiences of USMDs, DOs, USIMGs, and international medical graduates, because there, as much as there are commonalities between them, there are also distinctions. But what I do find is that US grads, were given support, more support along the way, support that often went unrecognized, right? That it's easy to kind of claim victory and say, I got here by pulling myself up by my bootstraps, by my own hard work, by my own intelligence. And I think it's easy to overlook a lot of the supports that people get along the way. The second chapter of the book looks at the selection processes at these two hospitals. So, part of what I found was that, the reason why programs are so segregated, part of it has to do with self-selection, right? So USMDs are often actively discouraged, actually, from applying to community programs. And so, not exclusively, but to a large extent. And so part of it is explained by where people apply, but that wasn't sort of a sufficient explanation because both programs received thousands of applications from both USMDs and non-USMDs every year. So the second chapter looks at how residency selection processes happen in these two places. And the sorts of concerns that were being voiced by program leadership in these two programs. I can say that I think the small community hospital, their main concern, in addition to recruiting the best residents that they could possibly recruit, was making sure that they filled their program. And that was one of the primary, motivators that they had for while, they did sort of interview some USMDs, they were really trying to make sure that they would be able to fill their rank list. And so they also interviewed a large number of non-USMDs, even if they preferred to have USMDs that would increase their program status. The larger university program, utilized a number of different justifications for not interviewing, almost interview no international or osteopathic medical graduates. There was only a handful that they interviewed every year. And one of the justifications that sort of emerges as a more implicit concern are, reputational concerns at the program level about how the program will be perceived if they match with even a small number of non-USMDs. So the first two chapters look at sort of how or why these programs are so segregated. The next two chapters, chapters 3 and 4, look at the experience of trainees in these two places. And I find that, because really, if there's segregation and USMDs tend to train in one program, but non-USMDs tend to train in other programs, who cares if they're getting the exact same training? And it turns out, of course, that they're not. The smaller community hospital had far fewer resources, offered less direct supervision of the residents. And as a result, the trainees were really left a lot to their own devices, having to once again create opportunities for themselves. And this particularly comes out in the fourth chapter, surrounding the kind of grooming that the residents received in preparation for things like fellowship. So a lot of the trainees at the community hospital, where there was very few research opportunities, really had to scramble and scrounge around to create opportunities for themselves in a way that US grads really didn't have to do, because so many opportunities were made available to them. So really what I found was a continuation during residency of some of the patterns, those same headwinds and tailwinds that I observed prior to residency. And then finally, I sort of look at where these graduates end up after training. And perhaps unsurprisingly, after having sort of 3 years of training in programs that had more resources and more support for them, USMDs ended up having, I think, a wider range of opportunities available to them. A greater proportion of them matched to fellowship, Whereas a lot of the non-USMDs had fewer opportunities, even though a good number of them really wanted to be able to pursue fellowship training and were unable to. So, and finally, the sort of last empirical chapter asks the question, how do residents make sense of these status hierarchies? How do they, how does it work for them in their minds? And what are some of the rationales that make these status hierarchies persist year after year, decade after decade? So those are some of the highlights, I think, of what the book tries to do.
Yeah, Tanya, again, I think the book is great, and I think that it leads to a lot of answers, but also a lot more questions. So I guess, again, I'm going to go into a few of my questions on the book, right? So the first question that I had is, hold on one sec. When you interviewed MDs at Stonewood, you found that few SMDs, this is a quote from the book, few SMDs said that they had considered applying to osteopathic schools as a possible plan B. Now, you also said that when you interviewed, and again, I'm going to focus on DO students because that's really what we're here to talk about. You said that, the DO students that you interviewed, about half of them, it was their plan B, half of them were really dedicated to the principles and practice of osteopathic medicine. But again, when you interviewed the USMDs that you interviewed said that really they were not thinking about osteopathic school. And you said that, in fact, most fervently advocated against this advice to someone not admitted to US medical school the first time around, and I'm paraphrasing, and that they felt that it was almost a form of cheating. And you said that a surprising portion, almost 50%, said that they would have quit medicine altogether if they had not been accepted the first time around. Right? I think that's very profound. And again, obviously, I think specifically when you're looking at that 50% of US DOs that decided to go to osteopathic school sort of as a plan B, like these are people that are really dedicated to medicine. So even though, again, I'm a proud osteopathic physician, I think that says a lot. Like, does that say something about, and again, we're talking about people that started in utero, like people that really figure out later in life, maybe they didn't, have this path, but they decide later in life and they're really dedicated, maybe more dedicated to medicine than many of the USMDs.
Yeah, and what I would say, I think I mentioned this as a kind of remark after that 50% statistic in the book. Who knows what the USMDs would have actually done if they didn't get in the first time around, right? So I'll just sort of, throw in that caveat. But I found pretty consistently different degrees of what we would call intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is when you are sort of driven to do something because you're really passionate about it, because that thing is what sort of gives you joy. Extrinsic motivation is when you're driven to do something partly because there are either external pressures that drive you towards that thing, or you get extrinsic rewards. So rewards that have less to do with the thing itself and more to do with sort of things around that particular thing. So an example might be salary, for example. So you don't love the work you do, but you're driven by the salary, maybe the prestige associated with the work you do, that sort of thing. And again, these exist on a spectrum. So I don't want to suggest that USMDs had no intrinsic motivation for going into medicine. That would be a gross mischaracterization of what I found. But I did find that, with non-USMDs, with DOs and Caribbean graduates, there was just this sense of, there's nothing else I want to do but medicine. Whereas a lot of the USMDs mentioned, well, there was medicine, there was law, there was finance. If medicine hadn't worked out, maybe I would have tried one of those other options. And so there were just really different motivations there. I think is really, really notable. And I think, may have implications for, the kind of health workforce that, we're trying to build in the country. And I think certainly, sheds a different light on, how DOs or Caribbean graduates might be viewed. I think there's often this mistaken understanding that these are failed MDs. That's certainly the way that a lot of decision makers at the large university hospital viewed DOs. And I think that motivation counts for something, right? Where there's such a drive and a passion for medicine and for caring for people that gets lost in the failed MD trope.
Right. I think that's spot on. The next thing that I wanted to talk to you about or discuss, and again, I'm going to kind of present what you discuss and then maybe put a little question and a twist. So when you compare the benefit of USMDs to non-USMDs, and you include DOs, you suggest that, again, as you stated just a few minutes ago, USMDs have more research opportunity, they have more mentorship, and they have more commitment from the schools to keep them in, compared specifically to foreign medical graduates. I think DOs are a little different. And they have a little less constraint as far as what specialties or what fellowships they can go into, right? So, I guess my thoughts on osteopathic medicine as I was reading the book, which I think is interesting, and I think that students maybe think about, is that DOs are, basically and maybe the social contract, they're sort of being trained to go into primary care. I think a lot of the osteopathic schools are looking to train physicians to go into underserved areas and to go into primary care. And maybe that's something that candidates need to think about before they apply. I mean, maybe the social contract as a generality is different. Is that possible?
It is possible. I think you might actually know this better than I would, but I'm not sure that that's the way the training is sort of framed for students. And I think that's really important. Setting expectations is really important, right? And so if the pitch to students is come and train at this particular location, and the sky is yours, you can achieve anything after this, it's just a matter of how hard you work, then I think, it sets a certain level of expectations for students afterwards that then, are met with a very different reality, I think, when it comes to match time. If, however, the expectations are such that, there's really this commitment to training a primary care workforce, and that's the kind of deal, right? If we talk about a bargain, that's the bargain that trainees enter into, then yeah, I think that can and is a different bargain, and that's terrific, right? I mean, we certainly need more primary care physicians. That's
right,
undisputed.
absolutely. So, on that same light, when and again, I'm going to, everything obviously from my perspective is a little biased. So like, it's going to be, my experience, but, you specifically quote from 2014, right? And your book is awesome. The charts are awesome. The data is awesome. Very easy to follow. But from 2014, 87% of USMDs match into the fellowship of their choice, 74% of DOs, and 63.9% of non-USMDs. So just, for me, the difference between 87% for USMDs and 74% of DOs is not that far off, so it's lower, but it's not that far off. And, again, I would say from my personal experience, there are, and again, just to give an example of my life. So I applied for gastroenterology, which is a very competitive internal medicine specialty. Arguably, of course, I'm biased, but the most competitive medicine specialty, because cardiology, which is also very prestigious and looked up to, has a lot more spots in GI. So it said that because GI is very limited spots, it's usually considered to be the most competitive.
Yep.
But there were a bunch of people applying the year that I applied for GI. And the first year that I applied, I actually did a chief resident year. I did an extra year to get GI. And the first year I applied, I didn't get a spot. And I did research and all these kind of things. And I could say that I didn't get the spot because I was a DO, but maybe I didn't get the spot because there were better candidates. And definitely there were other people that were applying for the spots who were USMDs who didn't do the research and didn't do those things, or DOs also that didn't do those things and ultimately didn't get a spot. There were a few people, there was a USMD and myself, I did a chief year. There's a USMD who did a research year, and we both ended up getting spots. And there were a few other people that decided they didn't want to do the work and went into primary care, which obviously is fully respectable. But again, it's just interesting to me that, like, you know, obviously your research is looking on a macro level, but on a micro level, you know, again, we're looking at maybe 13% less from 87 to 74, and 74 is still high. You know, we don't know what those actual individual students look like, right? I mean, is that reasonable?
I think that's true. I also think that, you know, those are global statistics reported by the NRMP for all fellowships, right? Actually, if we break it down by specialty, the disparity is a little bit more stark. And I do this in table 5.1. So anyone who's following along in the book can check this out. When you look at fellowship match rates by specialty and applicant type, and when we look at your specialty, gastroenterology, when you run the statistics, the odds of a USMD matching to gastroenterology were over 6 times the odds of a non-USMD. Now remember, the NRMP reports data based on USMD versus non-USMD. So I don't have the capacity with these data to break down necessarily what the odds of a DO matching versus a USIMG versus IMG matching. But you got 2 candidates, right, applying to the same fellowship program, the same competitive fellowship program, and the odds are 6 times that for a USMD to match into that particular specialty. So, you know, I think the difference between 87 and 74, you know, might not seem to be that big on the surface, and maybe it's not. I think where the rub lies is when, and this I certainly observed in my field work, where certain programs, no matter what the accomplishments of the candidate are, won't look past where they went to medical school. And there are some programs like that for fellowship. It doesn't matter how well accomplished or how many chief years you did. If you were a DO or you were an IMG, we're not interested in matching with you. That's where I think, you know, where there's the sort of the possibility for inequality to start to emerge, right? And I think, you know, I think the numbers, the match numbers point to some of that happening. It's not the only phenomenon happening. And as you point out, right, there are, and I certainly found that there can be differences in quality between applicants based on where they did their residency training. But, you know, I think there's also the possibility for that inequity to exist as well.
Interesting. My other comment, again, from my own personal experience, is that, you know, and again, I think the book is awesome, and you're comparing 2 specific residencies,
Yep.
which, like, right? So I did my internal medicine residency at more of a community hospital. I would say at the time that I trained, it was a percentage DO, percentage MD. There was a percentage of US foreign medical graduates. Most of those were actually from Sackler, which is an Israeli school.
Mm-hmm.
And I ended up doing, and it was great. And it was very, you know, it was very educational, very, we were really handheld, and we had lectures and all these types of conferences. And then when I did my fellowship, and I was really a little excited and proud that when you quoted one of the residency directors, they said, yeah, we had a resident once go to University of Miami for cardiology, which, like, I'm a big proud UM graduate. But, you know, when I went to University of Miami, which is this big powerhouse tier 1 GI program, which, you know, I'm blessed to have trained at, they, you know, it was an inner city hospital. Like most of my training was like, all right, guys, you're on your own, have a good time. And we really had no supervision.
Mhm.
So, you know, interestingly, like my experience of community versus university was actually different, almost the reverse of what you saw in those two
Hmm.
hospitals. Do you think I just had a strange experience? Do you think it varies? I mean, do you have any comment on that?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind, I did not study fellows or fellowship training, so I don't know what the experience of residents look like at a place like the University of Miami. So that would be one question I would have. Uh, but I think, I think you're touching on absolutely variation, and I make clear, right, that one study of two hospitals cannot possibly be generalizable to all hospitals in the United States, right? Um, in a study with colleagues that was published in the Journal of the General Internal Medicine in 2020, we did look at um, this phenomenon of segregation in residency training. How widespread is it really, right? Is it just a handful of hospitals that staff exclusively USMDs versus not, or is this a broader phenomenon? And in fact, we found that the hospitals that are like yours, where you train, where there's a sort of even mix, more or less, of MDs, DOs, international graduates, that they're in the minority, that only about 16% of internal medicine training programs across the country can be described as integrated in that way. And so instead, most programs, most community programs staff disproportionate numbers of non-US MDs, whether they're DO or international medical graduate, and then the large university hospitals staff disproportionate numbers of US MDs. So I don't know if that means that your training experience was in the exception. I certainly know that some community hospitals are very well resourced and have more of an academic model that is similar to the larger university programs. But I think that, the two programs that I studied, I mentioned this, right? They were neither at the very top nor the very bottom of the barrel in terms of programs, right? They were both affiliated to similarly tiered medical schools. And so, I'd like to think that they are somewhat, somewhat representative of the broader landscape of training, but there will be variation, undoubtedly.
Okay, Tanya. So my next thought, and I know I mentioned this to you as we were emailing back and forth. So there are a few books and that really propose ideas that I really like. And I don't know if you can sort of give some comment on whether they fit in with what you've seen. So one is a book by Angela Duckworth, which is called Grit. And it's a great book. I don't know if she's a sociologist. Again, she may be. You don't think so? Yeah. So Grit, basically, she looks at, her idea is that, we give, she looks at West Point in the first chapter, and she's trying to compare people's grades in high school, their academic accomplishment, and whether they will make it through Hell Week, which is like a really rigorous time at West Point. And she finds that it doesn't correlate very well, like their actual academic achievement doesn't correlate very well. So she sets out to come up with this grit scale, which is like how tenacious, how dedicated, how tough they are. And I always think of DOs as having grit. So, my question, again, especially, and I'm going back to that comment, we can't overgeneralize, but the fact that, maybe some of the MDs that you interviewed said that if they didn't get into on their first try, they wouldn't have done it. I think that DOs wouldn't have done anything else, a lot of my DO colleagues. And do you think that grit factors in, and maybe that grit also factors into them being great doctors? And, maybe, again, the whole idea that maybe the journey is what shapes them. And although you could look at all of these things as a negative, maybe going through all this actually produces, and again, I have plenty of MD friends that are great doctors, and I'm not putting anyone down, but my DO friends that are great doctors, I think they're not great, are they great doctors in spite of the fact of their training or because of it? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, your comment about grit actually reminds me of a comment that a high level official at the small community program that I studied made, where he talked about preferring to recruit international and osteopathic medical graduates for this exact reason. He talks about you got to admire that grit, is what he says. That that, and I find this right, that in order for DOs to make it as physicians, they have to go through way more challenges than the average MD who goes to a US allopathic medical school has to encounter. And yet, the popular belief is that they're DOs because they didn't study hard enough, or I go back to that failed MD trope, right? And so, one of the conclusions I have in the book is that, non-US MDs have all of these additional obstacles to face, and have to do more with less, right? They have to prove themselves as being superior in some cases to US MDs, with fewer resources to do so, right? With fewer research opportunities, with fewer places to do rotations at, with, in certain cases, fewer networks to draw on. So I absolutely would agree with that. And, I think to me, there's, I think part of the myth of meritocracy and the what's the word I'm looking for? One of the problems with this myth of meritocracy is that it overlooks a lot of the what are called structural challenges, those unseen challenges that folks have to overcome in order to be able to achieve the same things that MDs might achieve.
I agree, and I very much appreciate that. My last, Tanya, we appreciate your time so much, and your perspective. So my last kind of question and thought that I'd like you to comment on is, we talked about the game, right? So a couple of things, I want to talk about a couple of things on the game. And I guess the first point, or the first thing that was brought up, and again, we had a couple of email exchanges and I mentioned a few of these things. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was, that MD that said that the DOs and foreign medical graduates, but again, I'm focusing on DOs, the DOs cheated, right? That they went a different way to get into medical school. And I always think, I'm a sci-fi fan, not a Star Trek fan, but there's a thing that I love in Star Trek called the Kobayashi Maru. And what the Kobayashi Maru is, and I'll briefly describe it. It's this simulation where they put a Starfleet captain in a situation where they can't win, and they see how they act under stress. That's the drill, is the Kobayashi Maru. And Captain Kirk is legendary. He's this amazing captain of the US Enterprise, and he beat the Kobayashi Maru. And the question is, how did he beat the Kobayashi Maru? And there's a scene where they're about to die, and the starship captain says, "Kirk, I need you to tell me how you beat the Kobayashi Maru. It's an unbeatable situation." And he looks at her and he says, "I cheated." So, and basically what he did was he reprogrammed the simulation so that he could win. So, when I read that part in the chapter, that's kind of like the Kobayashi Maru. So did the DO student that, again, and a lot of DO students like the philosophy, and they do it because they wanted to go into primary care. They want to learn manipulation. I love osteopathic medicine. Some people do it because they don't get in. Would you say they cheated? Would you say that they found a way to beat the Kobayashi Maru? Tough question, right? Yeah.
My personal take on this, I think there was this, the term that was used by a lot of USMDs is it's a backdoor entrance into the profession, right? That they're getting in somehow, like you said, they're cheating. The reality of the matter is that there are not enough USMDs to fill residency positions by a long shot every year. And that's been true since 1945, since the very beginning of residency training. And so is it cheating to enter medicine, the osteopathic route, and to, to train and to fill much needed residency positions that would not be filled otherwise by MD? So there's no sort of, DOs are not taking spots away from MDs, as I mentioned. Even if every single MD were to match to a residency position, there would still be about 10,000 left over. So I don't think it's cheating. I actually think that, there is a need for physicians. There's a need for resident physicians, and osteopathic medicine is a different tradition. It's a different approach to medicine, but it's an equally valid approach in my perspective. And so, I think it's interesting when folks call it a kind of backdoor way of entry, because I think it's not a back door, it's a parallel door, if you will.
Right.
I think one that has had a long history of being stigmatized by, the allopathic medical profession, but that provides such important, much needed healthcare workforce to the country. So that's what I would say to that.
I think it's again a great answer, and I appreciate it. So my last little piece is on, I love the road to success, and obviously you found some of the things that I've discovered over my training just as amusing. So I'll just kind of spell this out. So there's a term called the road to success, which interestingly kind of changes. This is what it was when I was training. I don't know that this is the same, but it's radiology, ophthalmology, anesthesiology, and dermatology. So these are sort of the coveted specialties in medicine. Although again, people could argue orthopedics, plastic surgery, right? There are other things, dermatology we talked about. But I guess, my thought, and this, I'll take one step back. There was two podcasts that I listened to you on that you were great on. So if anyone listening to this wants to hear more, Tanya Jenkins, they can check out the Short Code podcast, which is great. And your interview was awesome. And then there was another interview I heard on the Annex Sociology podcast, which was also great. And interestingly, on both of them, they both cycle back to DOs. Like there's a big portion of both of those on DOs, which I thought was very interesting. The MDs and sociologists both honing in on the DO point. I thought that was interesting. And on the Annex Sociology podcast, one of the interviewers was asking you kind of like, aren't all of these people winners because they're USMDs? Like, how many people want to be? I'm going to cut that out, because they're US physicians, right? So aren't all of these people DOs, MDs, and foreign medical graduates? Don't they all win because they're American physicians? And I think to your point about the residency spots, they are all winners. And again, maybe you can comment, but in my experience, personally, even though you go on Medscape and maybe orthopedics has the highest salary, which I think a lot of medical students know, I have friends that are orthopedists. They love their job. Some of them don't. I wouldn't be happy as an orthopedist. So, I think students have to take a step back and look at the game. And you may win the game if you have a work-life balance and you're an internist and helping a large population of people. It doesn't mean that if you're not a dermatologist, or you don't get a GI fellowship, or you're not in an elite specialty and you attain the ability to be a physician, and that's really what you love to do, that you lost the game.
I would agree with you on that. I think the way we define winning the game, right? It's what sociologists would call socially constructed, in the sense that, right, it's something that is broadly agreed upon, and that's shaped by different factors. So you mentioned the road to success specialties. They haven't always been those four particular specialties at the sort of top end of the income spectrum or the prestige spectrum within medicine, right? That has changed over time. What I think is important for us to remember, so I agree that I think winning the game can look a lot of different ways. I think there are pressures within medicine to view winning the game as exceeding or matching to one of these top super competitive specialties. For some people that, you know, might be the case, right? If they've always wanted to be a dermatologist, right? That for them, that's winning the game. I think where we have to be careful is, I'll go back to that concept of meritocracy that we started with, right? That part of winning the game, part of the assumption of winning the game is that, you know, with enough hard work and dedication, anything is possible. You'll get your just reward. So those who win the game, according to sort of popular definitions of winning the game, those who end up matching into these very exclusive specialties are often viewed as having matched to those specialties because they were the most meritorious, because they worked harder than anybody else, because they deferred gratification for longer than anybody else. Again, hard work, dedication matters, but it's not the only thing that matters. And the caveat, the flip side to the belief that with enough hard work and dedication, anything, including the road to success, is possible, is that if you don't achieve those goals, if you don't end up winning the game, how it's broadly defined, it's your own fault. You didn't want it enough. You didn't work hard enough for it. So that's where I think, you know, I absolutely agree that there's probably 1,000,001 different configurations of what winning the game can look like for different people based on their interests, based on their priorities. But I think that oftentimes this is the way that it gets construed within medicine, and the myth of meritocracy really overemphasizes the sort of what is within the individual's control and underemphasizes all of these other factors, including beliefs about status, including beliefs about where you go to medical school and what kind of doctor you are as a result of that. That those other factors also play a role, and those are the things that aren't often looked at. And that was the goal of this book, was to shed some light on some of these unspoken factors that do play a role.
Tanya, I think you absolutely bring all of these things to light. I think everyone applying to medical school should read the book. I think it's so interesting to show a perspective, again, of things that practicing physicians that we all know, but when you're starting in the profession, you don't know. And I think the general public doesn't know. And I think your research is great. I think your book is great. I think your perspective is great. And I really appreciate that you wrote the book.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure chatting with you about it.
Tanya, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much as well.
Tanya.